Hi folks, my name is Jay. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at Fort Hays State University. This is a time stock. It refers to an op-ed article from 2016 by Mark Lila from the New York Times. This was one of the most commented articles in the New York Times in the year 2016. It elicited a pretty big response, both in terms of affirming Mark Lila's argument, but also a lot of criticism of Mark Lila's argument. So I want to discuss the article in detail, but broadly speaking, I want to discuss identity politics on both the left and the right. I use the phrase promise or peril here. Of course, Mark Lila is indicating that it's more peril than promise, and that effectively what identity politics does on the left is it fragments left politics. And it disables a kind of politics built on solidarity, a politics built on unified political messages, and it makes it harder for the left to win political elections. There's a number of facets to the article. I'm going to project a couple of fairly large quotes. Sorry for the wordiness of some of these PowerPoints, but I wanted to get a full quote of some of the Lila article here. You have it in front of you, however, so you can follow along. So identity politics, promise and peril of the American left. First of all, what I want to emphasize is that Lila's argument is not new. In fact, as early as the 1990s, philosopher Richard Rorty was writing about the inability of the left to carry on a kind of politics of solidarity. Core to the left political argument here from Rorty's perspective were the economic grievances of those who were left behind, those who found themselves in lower socioeconomic conditions, disadvantaged, and economically underprivileged. And that left politics should really focus on those things. And they've lost sight of this when they focus too much on what Rorty calls stigma. This article was published in 1998. So that's 20 years ago. This is not a new argument that Lila is presenting. It brings up perhaps some new color and characteristic, new challenges and tensions because of the 2016 presidential election, because of the unexpected win of Donald Trump, and the disappointment that many on the left, liberal and left, felt about that presidential victory and what it meant for the future of both the Democratic Party and the future of left politics. Now, throughout this talk, I'm not going to use the word liberal very often. There is a difference between liberal and left. And the focus here is less on a kind of liberalism and more on what left politics means. Very briefly, the difference that I see between left and liberal is that liberal politics tends to be a lot more of the center. I think that a lot of modern conservatives are also liberals. I think liberalism is a broad and comprehensive political theory, a commitment to individual liberty and individual equality that cuts across the political spectrum. Modern conservatives are liberals in an economic sense. Liberal economic theory, free trade, open border, or global trade, free trade, basic kind of neoliberal economics of material self-interest leads to greater prosperity for everyone. Conservatives tend to be economically liberal. Now, Donald Trump is a little bit different. He argues for economic protectionist measures and tariffs. Those are not quintessentially liberal economic ideas and theories. But on the whole, conservatism embraces economic liberalism. So that's just giving you an example of the way that I see liberalism kind of stretching across our political spectrum. So what I'm more focused on here in this talk is not liberalism, but left politics. And what the left side of American politics, what challenges are represented by what we call identity politics, what promises are represented by what we call identity politics, and where left politics is going to go in the future. So, just to give a kind of situating us historically and situating some of the problematic outside of the Lila article. Since the rise of the New Left in the 1960s, Democratic losses in elections have often been blamed on the fragmentation of identity politics as the main problem. Instead of rallying around issues that the whole nation can agree on, the argument goes, women, African Americans, LGBTQ, Muslims, etc., fall back on their identity and try to change politics alone. That identity politics is not just our identities in terms of our gender or sexual orientation or race or ethnicity that inform and help shape our political beliefs, I think that happens with everybody to a certain degree, right? Our life experiences, our perspective on the world, and our identity shape our politics. Identity politics is a step more. Identity politics suggests that this is the main locus from which we engage politics, from which we become politically active. It is the main focus from which we see how politics should operate and what we should do, right? So, split into various fiefdoms, the argument goes. The left can be said to be at once parochial and individualistic, tribal and cosmopolitan, disdainful of the average Joe, and above all, unpatriotic. As a result, the left cannot generate electoral majorities needed to consistently win presidential elections and advance its agenda. In short, the left should return to basics, focus on economic injustice rather than cultural grievances or what Rory calls stigma, and rebuild the New Deal coalition of the good old days. This is the argument, right? And one of the conversations that I want to have with you all is, do you agree with this argument? Or what's missing here? What's lacking, right, in this argument? What are they missing? Again, I see this as a kind of traditionalism on the left, which is often ill-fitted for the left. Traditionalism is much more sort of comfortably fit within conservative ideologies. But a return to the good old days, this sounds like a lot like Make America Great Again, but on the left, right? Make America Great Again, but through a New Deal coalition, right? I don't have a lot of time to go into details about the New Deal coalition, but it effectively was very much a patchwork of competing interests. A lot of different interests in play in a very complicated set of policies. FDR's New Deal policies were very complicated. There were a lot of ins and outs, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of various different interests coming to the table and fashioning something that was a compromise where every interest and every stakeholder got a little bit out of it. So it was a complicated construction of policy on the left, but it dealt a lot with economics, right? So we might say, broadly speaking, that identity politics is this: a tendency to form exclusive political alliances based on shared identity, and away from the broad-based coalitions that often reflected a New Deal environment, right? Now, as I'm going to come to, there might be something unique about the left side of American politics in that it is more diverse. There are more diverse interests, and it's more diverse demographically than, say, than the right side of American politics, right? I'll get to that here in a moment. So to the Lila article, Mark Lila's op-ed, as I mentioned, one of the most commented op-ed articles of 2016. It had about 2,500 comments. Lila's article is published in late November, early December 2016 after the presidential election. And you get the sense of like a liberal heartburn here from Mark Lila. Upset at the win of the unexpected win of Donald Trump, and sort of kind of a little bit of soul searching from Mark Lila's perspective about what happened, what went wrong for liberal Democrats and the left, and what solutions might be provided. So I see this article from Lila as a kind of scathing attack on identity politics as the main culprit in Hillary Clinton's unexpected loss to Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election. Most polls had her ahead, right? Pollsters were generally surprised. I actually think that Donald Trump himself was rather surprised that he won in November 2016. And so unexpected, yes, but where does the left go from here? This is the same kind of soul searching, in fact, that happened 4 years previous in 2012 when the Republican Party and their nominee, Mitt Romney, lost to Barack Obama and his re-election bid. They went through a soul searching. The RNC actually wrote a document called an autopsy in which they sort of tried to figure out what went wrong or where do we go in the future. Here's a quote from Lila's article. This is early on in the article, and you can read along with the PowerPoint. Hillary Clinton was at her best and most uplifting when she spoke about American interests in world affairs and how they relate to our understanding of democracy. But when it came to life at home, she tended on the campaign trail to lose that large vision and slip into the rhetoric of diversity, calling out explicitly to African American, Latino, LGBTQ, women voters at every mention, at every stop. This was a strategic mistake, argues Lila. If you are going to mention groups in America, you had better mention all of them. If you don't, those left out will notice and feel excluded, which, as the data show, was exactly what happened with white working class and those with strong religious convictions. Fully 2/3 of white voters without college degrees voted for Donald Trump, as did over 80% of white evangelicals. The number for white evangelicals, it shouldn't be that surprising. Evangelicals tend to vote for the Republican Party. Numbers are very high, even for Mitt Romney, John McCain in 2008. Yes, the numbers were higher for Donald Trump. Evangelicals seem to like Donald Trump more so than previous Republican presidential candidates, but the numbers are fairly similar. Political scientists call evangelicals a captured group, meaning that they vote consistently for one party again and again and again, and they often don't get very much in return. Evangelicals tend to be very frustrated with mainline establishment Republican Party, who want their votes, but don't really take seriously a lot of their policies. Republican candidates for president like Rick Santorum or Mike Huckabee might be more genuinely interested in evangelical politics than the evangelical right, but they rarely make any noise above the Iowa primary. The Iowa primary is usually where evangelicals do the best in Republican primary process. So does that make sense? Do you agree with that? Especially in these points that he makes. If you're going to mention groups in America, you had better mention all of them. Should we do that? Is that the politics we should aspire to? Or we mention all groups at all times? The further claim by Leela here is that if you don't, those left out will notice and feel excluded. Now, I think one of the interesting things about this article is that he's using the concept of exclusion and throwing it back on left politics. He fails to note, in other words, that the very process of rights for the disabled, LGBTQ, Black Americans, women voters, have been systematically excluded for decades and generations. And it's partly this exclusion which has formed the basis of a more vocal politics on the left. Right? Does that make sense? What do you think about those claims? Should we speak to all groups at all times? How to do so, if so? If we should, how do we do that? Yeah, is that
I think that seems to be an extension of political correctness. And as someone who recognizes as a minority race, when a politician speaks of Latin American voters or LGBTQ voters, I don't see it as exclusion. I see it as recognition of other races. I don't see it as a direct assault on your own identity, per se. And I think this article is taking political correctness a little too far and making it the enemy of the left.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ironies when we talk about identity politics today. One might actually make the argument cogently, it makes sense to me, that Leela is being a little too politically correct here. And that when representatives and politicians speak to particular groups and name those groups, right, this can be seen a lot less as exclusion and a lot more as inclusion, right, including voices. We still have, in this country, a difficult process of inclusion, making people heard. There are still, especially in our political environment, in our public world, in terms of voting, in terms of being politically engaged, right? In terms of being represented in Congress and represented in our local governments, we still have a great deal of exclusion we need to get over. Is this the answer? Is this the kind of exclusion that's worrisome? I'm not so sure. Yeah, you want to add something more?
Yeah, I feel like the people that are offended that other minorities are included are the kind of people who don't exactly like those minority groups or have some kind of vendetta against them. So when they get the equal recognition that they've always gotten, they feel offended or threatened by it because they're afraid of the equality of other minority groups to their own.
Yeah, and Leela, to his credit, actually speaks to this. And I want to highlight some of those words that he mentions here. Continuing on, Leela actually spends a lot of time focused on colleges and universities and our educational environment. and he sees our educational environment as part of the problem here. To quote Leela, "The fixation on diversity in our schools and in the press has produced a generation of liberals and progressives narcissistically unaware of conditions outside their self-defined groups, and indifferent to the task of reaching out to Americans in every walk of life. At a very young age, our children are being encouraged to talk about their individual identities, even before they have them." Big claim there from Leela. "By the time they reach college, many assume that diversity discourse exhausts political discourse, and have shockingly little to say about such perennial questions as class, war, the economy, and the common good. In large part, this is because of high school history curriculums, which anachronistically project the identity politics of today back onto the past, creating a distorted picture of the major forces and individuals that shaped our country." And in parentheses, he writes, "The achievements of women's rights movements, for instance, were real and important, but you cannot understand them if you do not first understand the Founding Fathers' achievement in establishing a system of government based on the guarantee of rights." Now, for all of us, many of us have gone through a secondary education in the United States of America. Does this ring true to your experiences? You say no? You gonna say more? Anybody? What do you think? Share some of your experiences about secondary education. Not everyone at once. It's a very lively crowd today. Don't worry, it's only Thursday. Yeah, Bella.
I think that, high school at least, they teach you just like the basics of history that they don't really never. It's like an example, they never talk about Japanese concentration camps that we had in the United States because I guess they just don't consider it an important part of history, or they don't want to reflect that be on American history in a way. But then, say for example, you get to college and you just like, yikes. But I guess he has a fair point, but I don't think you should blame the entire American education system for the issues that we have politically, because I don't think those are the root of the problems. I think that, say for example, how your parents taught you growing up is a factor. And also, the people that you surround yourself with are a factor too.
Yeah, and one might also make the argument that there is a problem on the other side of the equation here. There has been, for example, in Texas. Now, Texas is a big book buyer for secondary education and generally drives the market, right? Big populous states drive the market in terms of what textbooks are available for secondary education. And there has been some backsliding in terms of the narratives and the histories and the memory of, for example, the institution of slavery in this country in textbooks of history. There is still a paucity of exposure and information, not very much at all, about Latino history in this country, right? And the way in which it's deeply intertwined with the American experience. So one might make the argument that there is, in fact, a lot missing on the other side. And again, that the efforts that we make to more broadly include and be aware of the different heterogeneous groups and histories and stories of this country, there's still a lot of work left to be done, right? Continuing on here, a couple more quotes and then I want to leave it for discussion. Campus craziness. He continues on with, he goes into post-secondary education, colleges and universities. Quote, "When young people arrive at college, they are encouraged to keep this focus on themselves by student groups, faculty members, and also administrators, whose full-time job is to deal with and heighten the significance of diversity issues. Fox News and other conservative media outlets make great sport of mocking the campus craziness that surrounds such issues. And more often than not, they are right to," says Leela, "which only plays into the hands of populist demagogues," I wonder who he's talking about there, "who want to delegitimize learning in the eyes of those who have never set foot on a campus. How to explain to the average voter the supposed moral urgency of giving college students the right to choose the designated gender pronouns to be used when addressing them? Question mark. How not to laugh along with those voters at the story of a University of Michigan prankster who wrote in His Majesty when asked what his preferred gender pronoun is, right? And so Leela's poking fun here. Again, he's making another big claim that the right is, that conservatives are right to call this campus craziness. I have here a very recent article, University of Colorado, Denver, American Political Thought course removes white authors from the curriculum. This is not fake news. This is actually real. I know the professor. I'm friends with him. Chad Shimura is a friend of mine on Facebook and social media. He's an assistant professor of political science at UC Denver. He teaches a class called American Political Thought. I have taught this class many times before. The standard way of teaching American political thought is foundationally both political literature, but also broadly cultural literature. I teach it through the founding and the framing, but I also have Whitman and Thoreau. I have Frederick Douglass, What Does the Slave Is the 4th of July, Sojourner Truth. I deal a lot with W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and different conceptions of black liberalism, et cetera, et cetera. That's generally the standard way of teaching this course. Dr. Shimura has taken this course and excluded every single white author, and instead taught this course what he calls from the margins, right? A student who spent 2 days in the course and dropped out wrote a blog article in the College Fix, and it was picked up by Breitbart. Dr. Shimura now has a lot of mail in his email box from people all over the country and all over the world. He's now become one of these sort of lefty professors who are in the spotlight of conservative media. What do you think about these claims? Does this ring true to your college and university experience? Is there something wrong with designing a course like American Political Thought that attempts to speak about American political thought from the margins, from consistently excluded voices, and exclusively teach that class through those voices that have been excluded? These are tough questions. In a way, this is not necessarily an easy thing. We're talking about a number of things. We're talking about the meaning of American history, its past, and those who have been excluded, and the groups that make up a diverse fabric of America, of the United States of America. We're also talking about strategic politics to a certain extent. At least we began that way. What should the left do? How can the left successfully marshal a coalition of voters and activists and politically minded individuals to push the country in the way that they want it to be pushed, right? So there are a number of different questions here. And I'm not so sure we have a lot of easy answers. What do you think about this? Clint wants to say something.
I just think that a lot of this is getting blown out of proportion when it says that you removed all the white authors from the curriculum. That's cool, but if he wouldn't have said, I'm going to remove all the white authors from the curriculum, it just becomes a bunch of authors, which is what the country is made of. You know what I think? I think it's stepped way out of proportion, or if you would have just said, all right, this is going to be a class taught from the margins. We're going to learn the same stuff just from different points of view. Completely eliminates the outrage instantly. I don't see honestly where the outrage is from, but it somehow became that from, like you said, the kid that took 2 classes and left, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess I don't see how you can teach a fully comprehensive American political thought class if you're going to exclude a large chunk of authors. The way you describe the way you do it, it sounds like you include just about everybody, which is, I think, a good way to do it. But when I took the American Political Thought class here, we started off with Federalist Papers, we started off with Washington's inaugural addresses and stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot of history that comes from white authors. I mean, there's also a lot of history that comes from other races and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I certainly can't claim to include everything. It's impossible. There are always voices and narratives and stories to be left out in a syllabus for a course. There's always that challenge. I, as a professor, am always very aware of, in constructing my syllabus, do I have diverse voices in my course? Studies have suggested that those who feel marginalized in terms of their identity and their upbringing and where they come from, they look for those voices in their syllabi and in their courses. And they generally, really good quantitative study was done that suggested that those, that people of color, or women, or people of what are not sort of, the normalcy of our sexual orientation, often do better in courses when there are diverse voices. They have better grades. So we have some statistical outcomes that suggest that including those voices in our courses, maybe not to the exclusion of other voices, maybe not to the level that Dr. Shimura is taking it. And I think that Clint makes a good point. And I've talked to Dr. Shimura about this. He really does want to kind of light a fire under students. He wants the course to be, if not controversial, at least an eye-opener for the students, a shock, a surprise. And he advertises it as such, right? Did you have?
Yes, I did. On that note, I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of like your primary and secondary education is lived within the margins. We've definitely heard of like the Federalist Papers and our founding fathers, those things in American history, which is a secondary education course. So I think when you go on to continue your education, it's important that you are exposed to outside of the margins of that learning. I think it's important because you're just out in the world now, and it's good to get different perspective. I think outside of the margins, especially like in Kansas, with which you've lived inside the margins your entire education before then.
Yeah, good points. I taught a class at the University of Oregon called The Politics of Race and Law. And it looked at the way in which law creates race and ethnicity in the American political experience. One of the things that we looked at were the prerequisite cases that the 1790 Immigration Act that was passed in this country used the word white and said that naturalization is only available to those who are white. You can only naturalize, become a citizen if you're not born in this country, if you're white. This led to a series of court cases in the 19th century in which an Indian man, a Japanese man, an Armenian individual, a Mexican individual came to a judge and said, I'm white, I should qualify for naturalization. And judges had to make the call, who's white and who's not. This obviously pinpoints one of the realities of whiteness, which is that it is incredibly fragile and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Whiteness as a racial category is one of the most tenuous racial categories. Is an Armenian white? Is an Indian person white if they can prove an Aryan lineage, right? Is a Mexican person white? Is a Japanese person white? Who knows? And in fact, the courts and the judges were faced with a conundrum of having to rely on either common knowledge or scientific evidence to make these kinds of conclusions. And the conclusions, if you can imagine, were very haphazard and arbitrary. It really depended on the judge and the case, and it created all of this sort of complexity within law. Going back to the point that you make, this is something that you don't get in your secondary education, and something that I think is valuable in a college and a university setting. These are the kinds of things that we need to learn. Not just and I think that this is the perspective that a lot of folks who agree with the Lila article, regardless if you're a conservative or liberal or whatever, they often see the college and university experience as just teaching this sort of celebration of diversity at a surface level, right? That's not our task at a college and university education. We're here to teach the intricacies of the law, the tensions and difficulties of our past and our history, in a way that is concrete and substantive. And it's not just the only lesson that I want you to come out of my class with is that we should celebrate diversity, right? I think that the Lila article, in a way, and that perspective is perhaps too thin of a perspective, too surface level of what we're trying to do at a post-secondary education. Any other thoughts? Bella, you had your hand up as well? Had something else?
We talked about it.
Okay. One more quote. I think this is it. Oh, no, two more. The angry white male here, from Lila's perspective. The media's newfound, almost anthropological, interest in the angry white male reveals as much about the state of our liberalism as it does about this much maligned and previously ignored figure. A convenient liberal interpretation of the recent presidential election would have it that Mr. Trump won in large part because he managed to transform economic disadvantage into racial rage, the white lash thesis, as he calls it. This is convenient because it sanctions a conviction of moral superiority and allows liberals to ignore what those voters said were their overriding concerns. It also encourages the Latino Hispanic vote for Trump was much, much higher as a percentage than what a lot of prognosticators had expected. And so that should give us pause that this isn't perhaps that this electoral success of Donald Trump and the prospects of a 2020 re-election campaign, it's a lot more complicated of an answer than just simply perhaps a white lash, right? Than just simply about identity or about race, right? It's something more complicated than that. And we have to sort of analyze this and draw out some perhaps difficult inferences about what is really going on. Just to finish up here the Leela article. Finally, the white lash thesis is convenient because it absolves liberals of not recognizing how their own obsession with diversity has encouraged white, rural, religious Americans to think of themselves as a disadvantaged group whose identity is being threatened or ignored. Now, from my own anecdotal experience, I certainly can appreciate those observations. I meet a lot of folks in Middle America who feel as though they are increasingly left behind by coastal elites, by a cultural America which tends to ignore them. I would also say the same thing and reserve a lot of criticism for the establishment Democratic Party, who generally ignores middle class, especially white Americans. There was a very interesting Jacobin article. Jacobin is a kind of far left, somewhat anti-capitalist magazine on the internet. Jacobin published a very interesting and provocative article in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election. This was in July 2016, I think, or August, in which they said effectively this, that the two major parties in the United States of America don't give two nickels about white working class America or white poor America. And poor white America and working class America increasingly feels like they are ignored, left behind, that nobody cares about them. And that in fact there's a great deal of sort of cultural stigma, if you will, directed at them by our cultural complex, like Hollywood movies, music, television, et cetera, our entertainment cultural complex, which often looks at poor whites as, sort of white trash, right? Trailer trash, right? One of the worst identities you can have in America from their perspective, right? And I'm not saying that's right or wrong or that my observation is complete, but those are my observations that I from talking to a lot of people in my own family. I was born in South Dakota. I was born very poor, out in the middle of nowhere. I know a lot of people in my family who feel this, right? And in fact compelled them to vote for Donald Trump. Not to call out my mother here, but my mother was one of these people. My mother was a Bernie Sanders supporter. She loved Bernie Sanders. She voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. She wanted Bernie Sanders to win the election. When Hillary Clinton won the primary, she went ahead and voted for Donald Trump. And I think that there are other voters out there who maybe appealed to the working class logic and economic justice of the Bernie Sanders movement, but then were very turned off when he didn't get the nomination and went to what they saw as a much more establishment, DNC, like the Democratic Party under Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama is very much a Democratic Party. It's called like a technocratic Democratic Party, much more focused on coastal elites, right? On the tech industry on the West Coast, on college-educated, university-educated drivers, as they see it, of the economy that are generally on the coasts, right? And to the detriment of those, at least their perception of those from Middle America. White, rural, religious Americans thinking of themselves as a disadvantaged group. Such people are not actually reacting against the reality of our diverse America. That's an interesting point from Leela here. They're not reacting to diversity or multiculturalism from Leela's perspective. They tend, after all, to live in homogeneous areas of the country. But they are reacting against the omnipresent rhetoric of identity, that everything now, seemingly from their perspective, all of our politics is bound up in our particular identities. And from this position of our particular identities, this is how we engage in politics. At least this is what they see according to Leela. reacting against the omnipresent rhetoric of identity, which is what they mean by political correctness. Liberals should bear in mind that the first identity movement in American politics was the Ku Klux Klan, which still exists. Those who play the identity game should be prepared to lose it. Now, the heading that I provide for this quote is Identity Politics on the Right. And I think that this is one of the ways that we can see the rise, not just of Donald Trump, but the rise of the alt-right movement more broadly speaking. The alt-right movement very much is a kind of playing with the rhetoric of identity and identity politics on the right. Not necessarily Donald Trump, but certainly alt-right figures, folks like Richard Spencer, right, who is a white separatist. He claims he's not a white supremacist, he's just a white separatist. His argument is that whites should be proud of their heritage. They should be proud of whiteness. They should be proud of their European heritage. And that white folks should, and in order to preserve the value of their whiteness, should live separate from other races and have separated experiences. Now, this is a pretty extreme bit of rhetoric, for sure. Used to be a much more marginalized perspective in American politics, and now is a lot more in focus in our political environment. I think Leela is suggesting that the alt-right movement and the identity politics that are played on the right is very much in response to a kind of runaway identitarianism on the left. That identity politics, and I'll share with you my own kind of personal perspective on this. I think that there are different kinds of identity politics. And it has evolved and moved in different directions over time. And I do see that on the left, on left identitarianism, there is now much more of a tendency to be more moralizing and more accusatory. And seeing those who do not agree with their perspective of basing politics solely on identity as wrong-headed or even immoral. Now, this is not all of the voices on the left identity side of politics, but there are some. And I think that there are a lot of folks on the far right who have now borrowed much of that language. And it's now been translated over. And we have identitarians, some on both the left and the right, who are kind of like the bickering couple at the Golden Corral that everyone rolls their eyes at. And they're fighting with each other over politics. And meanwhile, core economic issues like wage stagnation in this country, we've got a real problem with wage stagnation. The average median wage has not gone up at all in the past 15 or 20 years. Actually, adjusted for inflation, it's gone down, right? That's not a good thing, right? We've got student loan debt out of control in this country. You look at the amount of student loan debt that is held by Americans, and the amount of Americans who are in default on their student loans, unable to buy a house, right? Home ownership, the percentage of first-time home buyers as a percentage of the homes that are purchased within a quarter or a month, et cetera, historic lows, right? It's down to like 24, 25%, right? At its high point in the 1960s, it was over 50%. Over half the homes purchases were first-time home buyers, right? So we've got real economic problems, and I think this is where Leela's coming at this to a certain extent. Now, I've got my own issues and criticisms of Leela. I think that, broadly speaking, and I think I kind of insinuated this, that he takes identity politics as this big umbrella term, and it's ahistorical. And it's just one thing, and he doesn't look at it within history. And he doesn't look at varieties of how identity shapes our political beliefs, and how identity is the basis of political action, right? He's taking the most extreme form. This, in some ways, I see parallel to and replicated in what is called the men's rights movement and their view of feminism. Their view of feminism is one particular kind of feminism, like radical cultural feminism, the Catherine McKinnons of the world, right? Who they label man-haters, right? Without understanding that feminisms is a very complicated set of political ideologies. There are more than one and some feminisms are more in argument with each other than they are with other things outside of feminisms, right? And so there's this simplification of what identity politics is that I think Leela could benefit from contextualizing more and making more complicated. Does that make sense? Any thoughts about that? Am I missing something here? Yeah.
Have you read his book based on this article?
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this summarizes a lot of the book, right? One of the things that I was looking for and hoping for in Leela's book was more statistical and quantitative.
Yeah, that was. Does he like back up his broad slander on high school curriculum and college curriculum?
Not much.
Does he document? Does he give any like history?
There's more history than there is statistical evidence, for sure.
I mean, where does he date identity politics as starting?
He sees it, I think, in this is a really interesting question, right? He begins to see this in like the mid-90s and late 90s. And I think that this is part of the problematic, is that we have to go back a lot further. We have to go back to the 1960s, the 1970s, and social movements that were built on identity of excluded groups who were demanding some voice and representation in politics. And I think he misses that ground, right? There are a number of deeper contextualized issues I don't think we have time to go into, but in the early 1990s, the way that identity politics worked in terms of feminism, in terms of racial justice activism, in terms of the emergence of queer politics and queer activism and disabled rights and other things, there was a very fluid and open ground there in the early 1990s, buttressed by a lot of philosophic theory about deconstruction. That, in fact, there was this perspective that identities can be deconstructed. Judith Butler in Gender Tribe, right? That gender is totally a cultural construction. And she even questions the biological foundations of sex differentiation. You look at critical race theorists and others who are racial justice activists writing in the early 1990s. They often wrote about the constructedness of race, that race and ethnicity were cultural constructions, right? There's no biological foundation for them. Well, the question then became, if these are cultural constructions, can we not deconstruct them? And then the further question is there a horizon beyond race or ethnicity? Should we deconstruct the language of race sufficient that we no longer have the language of race? We no longer have conceptions of race or ethnic differentiation. This is called liberal colorblindness of the early 1990s. Now, today, our colorblindness is more articulated on the right. Colorblindness is like something that Bill O'Reilly will say, right? In the early 1990s, that was a liberal and left idea. There were plenty of radical racial justice advocates in the early 1990s, for example, who argued we do need to move beyond the horizon of race. There is a future world in which we will not have race and ethnic language and perspectives, because there are just cultural constructions. That's not where we've gone. The left has gone to really to the realm of essentializing. The left views, and I'm not making any claims about whether or not this is right or wrong. I'm making observations from a political science perspective. The left often generally views, for example, sexual orientation, something we are born with, not something that is culturally constructed, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, will argue that we cannot escape race, that whiteness is a cage, that we cannot, that to escape, to articulate some argument that we should deconstruct race means that we're going to erase the past. And you can't erase the past. And that there is something essential about black identity, right? And this is very different from where identity politics was in the early 1990s. Does that make sense and kind of speak to the comment that you made?
Kind of.
Any thoughts?
Lots.
You want to share any?
You mentioned critical race theory. Kimberly Crenshaw actually wrote an article rejecting this piece.
Yeah.
And she points out that, in an American context, you can take this back to Reconstruction. Mm-hmm. We create the Freedmen's Bureau. Congress starts doing some things to try and actually make reparations, essentially, trying to get freed slaves into some sort of an equal playing field. And within 8 short years, as Ta-Nehisi Coates, took the title of his most recent book, they checked that. Why? Because it was politically difficult for Reconstruction advocates to continue to actually take the side of freed slaves. And so they went back to a nice okay, fine, you guys are just whining about your special interests.
Yep.
You're focusing too much on group identity. Black folks, hey, you're not slaves, so quit complaining about not having this particular civil right or that particular civil right. And essentially capitulated to the Democratic South. And, you know, in a way, this identity politics argument that Leela is making is the same argument that played out during Reconstruction.
Yeah, an anti-identity politics argument, right?
Well, I mean, I think the lion in the living room, or the elephant in the living room, is that when he says that identity politics on the left triggers a response, say, from the alt-right, he's ignoring the fact that throughout American history, mainstream politics has been, both legally, culturally, economically, etc., white male identity. It's just that because it's the sea everything is swum in, no one's noticed it.
Yeah.
Identity politics tends to call out the fact that things that we have taken for granted disserve, especially for universalistic policies that we might have seen going from like, well, you could start with Reconstruction, but you could also go to FDR and the New Deal. All of these supposedly grand old days, the Roosevelt dispensation that Little talks about, where we were all unified and we could all speak this universalistic language. It's if you look at the history, it isn't necessarily true. These things papered over, exceptions made to exclude various groups. All these wonderful periods in our history that we might call upon. He cites Reagan as very good at speaking the language of unifying Americanness. He cites Clinton as doing the same thing. But if you look at the Reagan administration and at the Bill Clinton administration, you find a whole lot of instances where marginalized groups were thrown under the bus, or their concerns were
Criminal reform, welfare
bingo,
reform,
mass incarceration,
privatization of prisons, yeah.
welfare reform. In other words, this is a perennial argument
Yeah.
that, I don't know, I mean, at a level of political messaging, if it's advice to the candidates running for the Democratic nomination, it might be pragmatic and smart. If the question is political theory, what kind of a world do we want to live in? He sort of grants that social movements take up the identity politics mantle far more than parties traditionally have. And he seems upset that we think that parties should follow suit. I'm not sure that anybody in existing social movements really expects political parties to do this. They either reject the notion of political parties as a guide to the future, or they view themselves as pressure groups acting on the parties to move them more to the left, especially when it comes to concrete policy proposals, as opposed to mere calling out, hey, African Americans, hey, LGBTQ, et cetera, at a stump speech. My issue with him is that he's just really broad brush, kind of establishment centrist liberalism, making arguments that we have seen so many times before. And the identity politics folks, the smart, savvy academic ones, the activists out there on the streets, they have a better critique of what's going on in the world than this does. So I was kind of hoping his book did a better job.
No, not really. I mean,
Okay.
But excellent points. And I want to touch upon that strategic argument. You said there at the toward the end that in terms of political strategy, in terms of what to do, this might be. I want to think about that a little bit more. But to summarize a really important point you make, this might not be anti-identity politics. One of the underlying assumptions here, which I think Leela might be missing, is that whiteness is often overlooked as even a race itself. It is just mere normalcy.
Yeah,
And
did he quantify, or, okay, look, he really, what was the quote? Yeah, he mocks the whitelash thesis, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about it as a convenient theory because it allows us to blow off the rednecks.
Yeah.
It allows us not to learn how to speak to people who are different from us, et cetera, okay?
Yeah.
But does he actually, in the book, because he doesn't in the article, does he actually disprove the whitelash thesis? Because everything I've seen shows that Trump supporters tend to max out on the authoritarianism personality scales, max out on racial resentment scales, and I mean, granted, we've had economic decline and stagnation in this country for a long time. You could make the argument that a lot of it was due to neoliberal political centrists, often from the center of the Democratic Party all these years. But in every instance of deprivation in this country, people of color, marginalized folks of all stripes, tend to have it worse. So does his book actually make a stab at debunking the white lives thesis? He says it's a very convenient thesis,
Yeah.
but is it untrue?
Yeah. From my perspective, no. And from my perspective, there are more books to be written about this. In fact, my dissertation advisor at University of Oregon, Joe Lowndes, effectively wrote this book from the New Deal to the New Right about the late 1960s and the realignment of party politics in the late 1960s under Nixon.
Right.
Very similar kind of problematic and set of issues that looking at what role does race have to play in the realignment, right? And I think that further analysis really does need to come out. We need more voices and more arguments about this in order to really sort of effectively evaluate to what degree there was a racial backlash going on in 2016. And what role did race and identity on the right play in the rise of both Donald Trump as president, but the broader alt-right movement?
I mean, the argument is that the dominant identity politics throughout American history has been white, usually male, usually property, started out property oriented. In other words, the more economically elite you are, we can say that has been the dominant but invisible ideology of identity politics throughout American history. It's only when that becomes criticized and that other stories are being told, i.e. diversity, which is what you get when you have different voices, that
the charge of identity politics
that
comes
whiteness
out.
becomes visible.
Yeah.
And once whiteness becomes visible, arguably it's weaponized by candidate Trump to a great extent. But it's all the liberals' fault for saying, it's the old argument that saying something is racist is more offensive or more racist than being racist.
Thoughts about that? Perspectives? Yeah, Bella?
I think in a way the purpose of this article wasn't really to teach any of us anything. It was more to open the discussion of identity politics and take an example of how race and just personal identity can affect the way that we think politically and the way that we act politically. And since it is an opinion piece, it's really just this man's opinion and the way that it can start a conversation, just like the one that we're having now, in a way, about how identity politics is a relevant issue and a relevant conversation when we are talking about the topic of politics.
Yeah, good points. Yeah, Zeta.
I think this article, I don't know if you saw, Elizabeth Warren tweeted a couple months ago, I think it was during Black History Month, about how the Civil War and slavery was a scar in America and we needed to make reparations to the people that were affected by it. And a lot of the replies are like, you can't focus on one race 100 years later. You need to focus on everyone that's economically disadvantaged, all minority races, all people that are at a disadvantage historically from that point on and farther back. And I think what he is focusing on is, I guess, the strategy of centralizing a certain race in politics that some politicians like to do, and then the sparse few very, very liberal people who think that, focusing on one identity is, the answer. I don't think he recognizes the fact that millennials, have this more economic centrist view of equality rather than each racial identity needs to be given so-and-so. It's more of a whole issue rather than one.
Yeah. Well spoken. Okay, so one question I want to leave you with, an important, I think, question here. What explains some of the fragmentation we see on the left? The left is actually, a lot of studies suggest the left is very hard to mobilize in terms of voters. There are more registered Democratic Party voters than there are registered Republican voters in the United States of America, but Republicans tend to have better turnout. They tend to be mobilized a lot better. They tend to be more cohesive. There tend to be a lot less interscene battles in the right than there is on the left. There are battles within the right, but they perhaps are not as in the spotlight in our politics as the battles that tend to come out of the left. And the left is seen as a lot more fragmented. Now, this is not just about identity politics. This is a broader social sciencey question. What explains some of this fragmentation of the left? A couple of different alternative answers. One, demographics. That the American left is actually much more heterogeneous than the American right, demographically speaking, right? Studies have suggested that the average Republican conservative voter tend to look like each other a lot more. If you are white, male, a property owner, well-to-do, and above the age of 50, there's a strong chance you're a Republican conservative voter. That demographic in particular tends to vote in one block for the Republican Party, for conservatives. On the left, it's much more of a patchwork of coalitions. You've got union, blue-collar, working-class individuals in Indiana and Ohio, et cetera, African-American voters, Latino voters, college-educated millennials, coastal tech industry elites on the West Coast, a variety of different Democratic, liberal left voters. So that might explain the difficulty of mobilizing the vote on the left. Number two, that it's about issues and not about demographics. That there are just simply more a diversity of issues on the American left. It has been said that if you take 4 or 5 key points, you could mobilize a lot of Republican conservative voters. It takes about 10 points to mobilize much more broadly and competitively the American left of politics, right? It takes more issues to mobilize left voters than it does right voters, right? If with right voters, I mean, it's gun rights, maybe abortion, economic liberty, whatever that might mean, and one other point, and you can mobilize a broad cross-section of Republican conservative voters. For the left, it's a lot harder. You need a longer list. And that might indicate that it's more about the issues than about demographics. Number 3, ideology, and this is the more difficult one. That the left ideologically tends toward critique. That the perspective of left politics is one that has more skepticism of authority than those on the right. Now that might surprise a lot of conservatives who generally find a deep skepticism of government, right? But this might be ideologically consistent in the sense that those on the left tend toward critique, critical theory, tend toward political movements that are more mass-based, activist-based on the streets, right? And a radical conception of politics. That's in some ways about tearing down authority. Whereas ideologically, the right side of politics tends toward authority. Some political psychological studies have suggested that those who are conservative thinkers tend to be more deferential to authority and tend to look at authority as a stabilizing force of order in society. This might come from a connection to traditionalism that conservatives have. Conservatives tend to regard the traditions, the heritage, the binds of the past that tie us together as a stabilizing force that they would like to preserve and continue, or maybe even revitalize, hence make America great again, right? So it might be a deeper ideological difference between the left and the right. Are there other explanations out there for why the left tends to be more fragmented and harder to mobilize than the right side of politics?
I think it has to do with what people expect their government to do for them. Like, you say to mobilize the right, you have to have like 4 things, 5 things. Well, I mean, that goes to show what those voters expect their government to do for them. Protect their rights, make sure they're good economically, and then that, we don't go to war when we don't want to go to war, or something like that, whatever.
Yeah.
Where on the left you have, I want you to recognize me as who I am, and all these other things, like, is that what a federal government should be responsible for? And I think that's where you get to this fragmentation, like different groups of people wanting different things from their government, and I think that's pretty bland explanation, but.
It sounds a little, Clint, like the issues are maybe predominantly driving this. What do y'all think? And a couple of other questions. We're coming up to a 2020 presidential campaign. This campaign has already a number of Democratic Party nominees who've already thrown their hat into the ring. One of the questions, concerns perhaps, things to think about, I think, within the liberal left side of our politics, is that we have two broad frontrunners right now. One is more establishment and one is a lot more progressive and left. Joe Biden, they're both old white men from the baby boomer generation. My own observation here is I think the Democratic Party is going to have a difficult time nominating an old white man for a nomination for president in 2020. And I'm not making any normative qualification there, that's just an observation. I think it's going to be difficult, right? Where do we go from here? Where do you see the Democratic Party nomination? How is it going to be developing? How should these conversations play out? To what degree are these questions about identity, about diversity in America, about who represents us, who do we want to see represent us? To what degree should these have a central role to play in the conversation about who gets the Democratic Party nomination for 2020? Those seem to be really crucial questions.
Jay, where would you throw in the media in terms of your other explanations? I think it plays a relatively influential role in terms of centralization on the right versus more decentralization on the left. Your comment?
Yeah, I mean, I do see much more cohesiveness on the American media of the right, for sure. The American media of the right makes a lot of noise and pushes a lot of issues, and what I call the kind of outrage machines of media politics. There's a lot of outrage on the right. And that outrage can sometimes take on hypocritical forms, like, for example, the accusations directed at Joe Biden now. You have a right-wing politics that is generally very strongly aligned with Donald Trump. Donald Trump has his own questions about how he treats women in his private life, and now they're coming out with like a whole Creepy Joe campaign. I think that there's a lot of cohesion with regards to that, and that might factor in here. That might be actually one of the explanations. There has been, since the 1980s, right-wing talk radio and right-wing cable news has been remarkably consistent and on message and remarkably successful in mobilizing conservative voters. And so you can't take that out of the equation in some ways. Other comments? Yeah, Brogan?
If the left's more politically diverse, like you say, how come the majority of the candidates are white males?
Well, just this picture here this is the new 116th Congress. You can see the Democrats down on the bottom and the Republicans on the left. The Democratic Party is becoming more diverse in terms of identity, at least with the incoming Congress. We do have a number of nominees who are coming from very different intergenerational perspectives, perspectives of different sexual orientation. Got a number of women, Kamala Harris, a woman of color. So there's a number of nominees in the Democratic Party who are trying to capture that mantle of reflecting a more diverse world, right? But I think that's really at the heart and at the center of what's the left going to do? And is this a problem? And then strategic, what Leela identifies as a problem. Is it a problem? And where do we go? And especially for those on the left and those who are affiliated with the Democratic Party, where do we go from here? And I think this is the key question, to leave you with this question, is how can the left embrace diversity, but also build solidarity necessary to be successful electorally and in governance, right? That becomes the key question in a way. How to balance out the important competing claims of a long process of exclusion and the necessity of including diverse voices, right? And not just celebrating diversity, right? Not just raising awareness. I'm generally, my own personal perspective, I'm generally very skeptical of the phrase raising awareness. I always wonder what that does politically. What is its outcome, right? What does it ultimately achieve? And I would encourage us to think beyond just raising awareness and actually thinking about what goals can be achieved. Both electorally, yes, winning elections is important, but more crucially in terms of governance. What are we going to do about policy, right? What policies are going to create a better America, right? And those things are, I think, carry a lot more weight than just simply the notion of celebrating diversity. Yes, we should, in a sense, celebrate diversity. The United States of America is one of the most diverse countries in the world, right? Remarkably diverse. You go to places like, Queens. I always tell this to my students. Queens in New York City. There is literally a person from every country in the world in Queens, right? And that is the basis of a strength in America. But that's not the end goal, I think. That's only the starting point, right? The question then becomes, what do we do with it? What do we do with this diversity? And what kind of outcomes do we want? I think we're done. It was nice chatting with you. And again, my name is Jay. A difficult set of problems. I encourage you all to think strategically. I'll leave you with those last points because I think that those are important points. Come seek me out if you want to have further conversations about this topic. And thank you all very much. Thank you.